Canada is a great place to live, but we do have a bit of a past with some black marks on it. Things such as the residential schools of the First Nations, the Komagata Maru incident, the Chinese head tax, and of course, the Japanese internment of World War II. Today, we have Marlene Mortensen to tell us a bit about how it affected her family before, during, and after that time. Your family was relocated during the Japanese internment, but prior to that, what was your family like?
Before that, my mom and dad were newlyweds living in Tofino, and they had a little boy, Ken, 2, and Bud was 3. And my parents were John and Mary Matacoro. Yeah, and they had been in that area for about 20 years, but prior to that, they were in Steveston. That's where they were both born.
Okay. Yeah. Your dad was a fisherman? And
yeah, he had a trawler called the Crown. And yeah, he loved, well, at first he didn't love fishing because he started when he was 14 or 15 to help support the family, so he wasn't crazy about it then, but then he grew to love it, yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And your mom?
My mom, she was born in Steveston, but she they both grew up in the Tofino area. That's where they met and married at the St. Columba Church in '38. But she was attending Girls Central in Victoria. And they both had to quit school because their fathers passed young and support the family. So life was good for them in Tofino. They had lots of good neighbors like the Robertsons, the Arnett's and McLeods. And you know, they were part of the community. There were local dances, children had friends and everything like that, so life was good. So, and they also owned some property. They called it Storm Bay, but the locals called it a derogatory term, but I'm not going to say it. And they bought it off of Mr. Grice. Okay, and so yeah, so there were several families living on the property. I have a map of that, yeah.
So they were just basically regular members of the community,
members,
like anybody else.
Yeah, and Dad was also a member of the Fishermen's Co-op because one guy had left, so he took over doing the books. Yeah.
That must have been a very peaceful life at that time.
It was, yeah, and that property is still beautiful to this day. And fortunately, the owners since that time have allowed us to walk the property. So. And they even put up a tree in honor of my dad, the Yosho tree, yeah.
Going into when Pearl Harbor happened, and then, of course, within a few months, being forced to relocate. Yeah.
What was that like? My dad was, I've got a book there of my dad's exact words, but he said it was a shock. It was a Sunday, and he said he was just walking, and his friend Jack said, "Johnny, have you heard? Imperial Japan or Japan bombed Pearl Harbor," and my dad could not believe it. It was a horrible act, by Imperial Japan, but unfortunately, Japanese Canadians were blamed for that and came under suspicion. So it was a total shock and life changed. It was, devastating for them. That very same month, they came and took all the fishing boats, and so there's an iconic picture in New West with all the trawlers and other boats all bunched together, and so so people didn't know what was going to happen to them. They were worried, like, are they going to, surely they can't, move us. We're, Canadian born. Maybe they'll take the nationals, and so my dad, between that time and the spring, all they could do was try and carry on and. Yeah, they were under a lot of suspicion by some of the neighbors. They were mistrusted, probably hated, blamed. There was a lot of worry and pain, yeah. And then in the spring of '42, the authorities came right to Storm Bay, and they told my dad, "We're going to load you up on the Princess Maquina, which is a boat, and Dad says, well, can you at least give us 24 hours? And so Dad had to go door to door alerting everybody because the phone lines had been cut. And so he said, we got to do stuff with our belongings. So people either gave them away, sold them at rock bottom prices. My mom gave a prized grandfather clock to a family, and they said, oh yeah, we'll keep it for you. But they didn't, but that's another story. And yeah, it was a pretty horrific time. My dad's words are in there in the Settling Clayoquot book too. And he remembers that it was at nighttime. It's vivid in his memory. And they loaded up the boat and picked people up along the way and came to Port Alberni. And at Port Alberni, my mom wanted to get some medication for my brother Bud. He was suffering from eczema. And so they thought she was escaping, so they chased her up Argyle Street, but she said, I just want medicine for my son. And I think one of the local people in Port Alberni, George McKnight, I think he witnessed the people being loaded up onto the train. And then they were taken to Nanaimo and crossed over the channel or the strait to Vancouver. And they were taken to the P&E grounds and housed in the horses' stables. They separated the women and the young children from the men and the older boys. And yeah, the stables were quite dirty, smelly, and there was no privacy. So it was not a good time, yeah.
No, so they were actually breaking up families.
Yes, yeah. And then my dad was there for about a week, and then they wanted guys to go work in Ontario on the highways and in the farms. So they mostly wanted single guys, but somehow my dad, as a married man, was lumped in with them. So my mom and dad were separated for a few years. My mom ended up in Popoff, and I have a map of the different internment camps or prisons or whatever you want to call it. And she ended up in Popoff. And she shared a cabin, and I think there were 6 people allowed to the cabin. So there was my grandma, Ina Matacoro, and my mom, the 2 little boys, Ken and Bud, my auntie Cooney, my dad's sister, and my dad's uncle. And then when Cooney's husband arrived, Uncle had to move elsewhere because there were only allowed 6 in the cabin. And yeah, it was pretty cold, and in those cabins. I've got lots of pictures there, but they tried to carry on. The province of BC was not interested in furthering the children's education, so volunteers stepped in, missionaries, I believe in Greenwood, the Catholic Church helped the families a lot. So they tried to carry on life as normal. And Mom said that the Doukhobors in the surrounding area, they're a religious sect, I think from Russia, and they were very kind. And so sometimes they would bring apples, and so Mom and Carr Suzuki, David Suzuki's father, one day they decided, okay, I have sugar, we've got some apples, and made pies for everybody, apple pies. So they tried to carry on. What else could they do? Yeah. In the meantime, Dad was, after a week at the P&E grounds, he was taken on train from the CPR station in Vancouver. And he said the funny thing was, as the further east they got, and especially past the Rockies, there was less fear, and they were treated better by people. Yeah, so that was, he just noticed that. And so he ended up in Schreiber working on the highways for a while. And then they wanted volunteers to work in the sugar beet fields in southern Ontario. So he volunteered there as well. And he said that some farmers were, treating them badly, like if they wanted water, we'll take it from the animal's trough. And Dad and the guy said, no, if you're going to treat us like this, we'll work for another farmer who was nicer. So, yeah. Yeah, so Dad worked in the fields, and then eventually they needed volunteers elsewhere, so he ended up in Toronto and started working as a welder. Working during, I think he worked at in the day and went to school at night. And then a year and a half later, something like that, he called for my mom and the boys to join him in Toronto. And he was able to buy a home at 35 cents an hour. He was able to save up a down payment and buy a home on Phoebe Street, and you can see the CN Tower from that.
But it must have been hard, especially the military and the RCMP. None of the forces like that considered the Japanese people here to be any threat whatsoever. It was basically all political.
That's right. I think in the federal Canada, they didn't see the Japanese Canadians as threats, but in BC, the politicians sure did, especially guys like A.W. Neil, the mayor of Vancouver. But there were also good politicians like Tom Lee Douglas of the NDP party. So that's why our family has mostly voted NDP, yeah, because we appreciated his support and understanding, yeah.
And when your family were forced to relocate, you were only allowed to take, I believe, one suitcase?
Two suitcases, yeah, two suitcases. So I don't know how my mom managed with 2 little boys and 2 suitcases, but yes, that's all they were allowed. So the artifacts that you asked me to bring, there aren't many, Gerald. I found my mom's cookbook from Victoria Girls Central. My mom and dad's wedding record with all the guests and their names in there. Very little. Some photographs. They were very important to our family. Yeah.
Yeah. It'd be very hard to put a lifetime into 2 suitcases.
Yeah, that's right. A lot of the families I heard in Ucluelet, some of the fishermen were burying their gear in the backyard. Other people hung their dolls from the rafters. But eventually, I think things were looted. We know of some instances. So.
Yeah, it was quite a hard time.
Yeah, it was very hard. And it's just not the loss of physical property. It's also the loss of their pride and dignity and self-worth, loss of community, loss of culture. So a lot of losses, yeah.
And how did they feel, kind of knowing that basically this whole thing was politically motivated?
Well, they just felt like, hey, we were born in Canada. What's going on here? Yeah, they couldn't believe it. Yeah, because, Canada was also at war against Germany and Italy, but they didn't round up all those people. There are some instances. I know of one case where, a professor of German descent was brought in. Some people lost their radios, but nothing as the same as what happened to the Japanese Canadians. So they lost their property and boats and cars and businesses. But Gerald, I don't know if you know this, in the U.S., all that was returned to the Japanese Americans. Canada kept the Japanese Canadian property and used it to fund their internment. So they never got any of that stuff back.
I never knew that part about the American.
Yeah. And there was, even though they were under suspicion, I've read a lot of books, never one act of sabotage in Canada or the U.S. Yeah.
Did any of the young men serve?
Oh yeah, a lot of Japanese Canadians served in World War I, and they were fighting for the vote back then. And then in America, in the States, a lot of Niseis, the second generation, served. Probably were given the toughest assignments, but they served with pride.
I know a number of them served in Europe, I believe,
yes.
Italy and some other parts in France, and that
right.
They had some very hard areas.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, like in Honolulu, there are museums where they display the Nisei involvement and everything. And at Pearl Harbor, there's a little tiny notice in a far corner, and it said that at the time of the bombing, the attack on Pearl Harbor, 40% of the people on Oahu were of Japanese descent. And some of them were put in camps as well, but not one act of sabotage there or in Canada. I can't say the same happened to the Japanese Canadians. There were instances of being threatened. There were some suicides. Some people just disappeared.
Yeah. So sounds like the Canadian camps were actually worse than the American.
I don't know for sure. I just know there was a camp called Manzanar, and they were all kept behind barbed wire in Manzanar, but I don't know. I haven't read enough on them. Yeah. So after the war ended in 1945, you know, the bombings in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and a lot of people felt that was necessary to end the war. I'm a pacifist. I don't believe in war at all. But anyways, yeah, so after the war ended, my family were in Toronto at that time, and our brother Dennis was born there. So the third child was born there in Toronto. He's the only person in our family born there. And life was good. Yeah. They, you know, I have lots of pictures of them going to the beach and having fun. The boys were playing hockey, and my dad became a super Toronto Maple Leaf fan. And my mom would line up for tickets really early in the morning. And I forget his name. Oh, anyways, he told Mom to go home, little girl. It was too early in the morning. But yeah, he's a famous, yeah, he's affiliated with the Toronto Maple Leafs. The name escapes me right now, but yeah, they were having you know, a good life. And then I think it was 51 or 52, BC Packers came to, I think it was one of the big hotels in Toronto, and wanted to recruit the Japanese Canadian fishermen back to BC because they were needed. And they said, we'll help you buy your boats and all that stuff. So gradually, you know, different family members came back to BC. I think my dad came back in 52. I think my first was my uncle Tommy Kimoto, and then my dad John Matacoro, and then my uncle Harold, and a number of other men returned to the coast. My dad wanted to just fish there, in, you know, in the spring and summer and come back to Toronto, but my mom said, no way, you know, I'm not staying here with these three boys. And Dad says, no, yeah, but anyways, Mom got her way. and so after,
moms usually do.
Mom got her way. So my dad had the Challenger 2 built on Gabriola. And yeah, so Mom followed, I don't know how long after, on the train across Canada with the two older boys kind of misbehaving, and Dennis was an angel, and they got back to BC. And my dad wanted to move to Marpole in Vancouver, but I think my mom had other plans because her brother was moving to Port Alberni. So we ended up in Port Alberni. But, you know, Gerald, nobody returned to Tofino, because in 1947 there was a resolution by some of the councillors, and they said, we don't want them back. We don't want their business here, we don't want them back. So when fishermen came back from Ontario and Quebec, they came to Ucluelet, and they came to Port Alberni and other places, but not to Tofino because of that resolution. Yeah, which was finally taken off the books in the 1990s.
Oh, that's a long time to have a
resolution yeah.
like that.
Well, Sada Sato was he was an architect of Japanese descent, and he wanted to build on Chesterman's Beach. So he went to City Council and he asked them to take it off the books. And there's this back and forth that, well, it wasn't really there. No, it wasn't, but I've seen the paperwork, so yeah. Yeah, and so there wasn't an official apology by Tofino in 2019, I think.
And I believe even after the war, for the first, about 1947, Japanese were not supposed to return or not allowed to return to the West Coast.
That's right. They had the choice of either going back to Japan, but the funny thing is most of them had never been to Japan. So some families took that route, and then they came back again after the war, came back years later, and we call them Kike Nisei, yeah, sort of returning second generation. I'm a Sansei, third generation. So I was born after the fact. But yeah, that's what happened in 47. And then 49, Canadians of Japanese descent and First Nations were given the right to vote April 1st, April Fool's Day, 1949. So I don't know if that was somebody's idea of something funny to do, but anyways, yeah, it always struck me funny, yeah.
It seems like an odd day for something like that.
And so, I was born in 53, I didn't, 43, 53, and my brother Brian was born in 56. So I was looking through our records and I actually found a citizenship for my mom dated 1954. Even though she had been born in Steveston in 1918, she gets the citizenship certificate, and so I think she just basically filed it away. My niece, she's historian. She teaches at Carleton University, and she asked me, how did my mom feel about this? And I think it was no big deal. She just shoved this away because she always considered herself Canadian. Yeah. And just a side note, my niece, she teaches at Carleton. She did not want to study about the Japanese Canadians because she said it was too close to home. Yeah. So even fourth generation, it still upsets us. Yeah. That's my son Jan and my daughter Tova's generation, the Yonsei generation, the fourth generation, and now there's the fifth generation. So, which are my grandsons, Alex and Isaac. Put a little plug in for them. Yeah.
And thank you so much for, it's been very informative. Even here at the Plain Mill, there had been a Japanese community that had been here for a number of years. They were all picked up and taken away to camps. Now there's nothing left of that community but an empty field. These people were just like you and I, trying to make a living and enjoying life with their families. Hopefully from this, we can learn and make a better and stronger Canada. We've only seen a small part of the story. If you'd like to know more, drop by the museum, drop by the archives, and we'll be happy to help you. This is Gerald LeBeau, your friendly neighborhood time traveler, and I'll see you next time, whenever in time that may be.